And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. I'm delighted to have our favourite, can we call you an Islamophobe? I don't know. Robert Spencer has been with us many times. Robert, always good to have you. Thanks for giving us your time today.
Peter, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Not at all. And you've got, I'm sure we'll have you on later on the year because I know you've got a book coming out in November. And I love the title, Holy Hell, Islam's Abuse of Women and Infidels Who Enable It. I mean, kudos for the title. I'm looking forward to reading that. That's a key issue in terms of what we face in terms of women and how we're being treated. And of course, Jihad Watch, make sure the viewers and listeners at Jihad Watch RS, make sure and follow Robert on X and jihadwatch.org, the website, with a fantastic amount of information on the geopolitical side, but also on the purely on the religious side. It'll be well worth your read. But Robert, your first time you wrote a book was 2002, called Islam Unveiled, and obviously following on from 9/11, disturbing questions about the world's fastest growing faith. Um, you've got a book coming up, and I know you did work behind the scenes in a decade or so before that, but your public side has been in the last 22 years. Maybe if I could ask you about where we are at the moment in terms of discussion on Islam. I'm wondering, has America got to the position where I guess critiquing Islam is an acceptable conversation?
Oh, I don't think it's acceptable any more than it ever has been in the United States. It might be a little bit more because people are waking up to the reality of what's happening as they grow more aggressive. For example, in Epic City, the East Plano Islamic Center is attempting to create a Sharia enclave in this area of Texas, and that has gotten a lot of notice. There are public displays such as Muslims shutting down streets in Philadelphia or blocking large areas of New York City for public prayers. And this kind of thing awakens people to what's happening. But the American people, like the people in Britain and elsewhere, have been thoroughly propagandized now ever since 9/11, very skillfully and relentlessly, with the idea that Islamophobia is the real problem. Islam is completely benign, peaceful, and to be encouraged. And there's nothing that's wrong with it. Anybody who thinks that the terrorists have anything to do with Islam don't understand Islam properly, and the real thing is nothing to be concerned about.
What about in the media space? I know you do many different interviews and many different shows. Some of them you'll be speaking to an audience who already accepts the position that we have an issue with Islam. Other audiences may actually have never heard it before. I mean, what has been your experience in terms of engaging in the media over those years?
It was a lot more open in the first few years after 9/11. Then the trauma was fresh and people were willing to have this discussion. And so I was on PBS and CNN several times, and Fox, of course, many times, the BBC, and many others that would never have this discussion today. And any time that somebody like me, not just me, but others as well, is on a mainstream program of whatever kind, then the hosts are inundated with protests as to how you could have this terrible person. It's as if what the left has decided and the Islamic groups have decided is that people like me can talk to people like you, and that's okay. But if I talk to the BBC, which of course the BBC knows not to do this anymore. As a matter of fact, Peter, just as an aside, the last time I was on the BBC was when I was banned from Britain. And I happened to be working in the middle of the night because I couldn't sleep. So I was here working, and I saw the BBC announce on Twitter at the time that they were about to have a discussion of whether Pamela Geller and I should be banned from entering the UK. And so I wrote to them on Twitter and said, how can you have this discussion with neither of us participating? And so they were shamed into having me on, and that was the last time. Now they know better, but in any time that one of those media outlets like that might consider airing this point of view, then they're inundated with furious protests and demands for equal time, as if their point of view is not getting heard 99% of the time as it is or more. And so, yeah, there is a lot of media, but it's only the media that's open to this issue and to discussing it honestly, which is not the mainstream media.
What about so one other thing I want to ask, actually, never asked you, is about your method of delivery. Because if you look at someone who shares all our concerns but puts it forward in a very different way, would be Tommy Robinson. And I think he sometimes falls into the trap of being too emotional and too in your face, where you deliver it in a way that's very gentle and mild, and people cannot get annoyed at you because of your method of delivery. They may get annoyed at the material, but not about the method. I mean, is that something you've learned, or are you just fairly chilled anyway?
Yeah, I've just never been like that. If I wanted to be Tommy Robinson, I couldn't, and so maybe I should have worked harder at trying to be like that, because obviously he's an international hero and somebody who everybody knows, and so maybe that was the way to go. But I always have tried to, and that's not to take anything away from Tommy, but I've always tried to portray, put forward what I am arguing on a rational basis with evidence, which is not to say that he doesn't do that or have it available. But in any case, uh, I'm trying to appeal to people on the basis of reason. And one thing I've learned over the last quarter century is that people don't work on the basis of reason. But now I'm an old man, and it's unlikely I'm going to learn any new tricks.
Um, can I ask you about the political will in America? Your time on speaking. I know that the revelation came out, goodness, 15 years ago, that some of your books are being used by the FBI. And of course, this was shock horror. And immediately they were taken down. Like, they couldn't use anything by Robert Spencer. But what about that political will to actually confront Islam in the US? Have you seen any change in that, either at the local or the national level?
A small change, and that is, for example, the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, announced a few months ago that they were going to be working against radical Islamist terrorism. Now, she knows to use this term because she knows that really Islam is completely benign and has nothing to do with terrorism, and it's only this perversion of it. But I'll take that, actually, because that's a great improvement over the last administration, which repeatedly insisted that white supremacism was the biggest terror threat the nation faced. There was no basis for that in reality, but that's what they said. And so there is no political will to face the full reality of the problem. Nobody's doing that anywhere along the political spectrum. And as a matter of fact, this has always been the problem for me, that people I've thought would have been naturally allied and in line with this point of view have thought instead, well, we want to court Muslim voters in the US. And so they don't ally with this point of view. Not about a year ago, I was speaking at a group in California, and uh, spoke to them about mosques and how mosques are so often called Islamic centers because the idea is that it's a center for dawah, Islamic proselytizing, and ultimately for jihad. And Americans need to know this so that they realize that a mosque is not just the equivalent of a church or synagogue. It is a political entity that has implications in, or ought to, for public policy. And there was a local politician in the audience who got up and started bragging about how he had been the only Republican candidate for whatever it was he was running for to visit the local mosque and to appeal to the Muslims to vote for Republican. And I thought, does this guy not have any idea of the truth of what I was just saying, or does he not even realize how he's being manipulated and played by these people? But in any case, that's the dominant main. He represents the dominant mainstream, not the perspective that I was putting forward.
And that you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard talking about radical Islamist groups. Um, I mean, I can understand the word radical because radical is about maybe going back to your roots, and that is the concern. The I guess the best Muslim is one that's not radical because they have no understanding of their history and they see this as a as maybe a cultural cloak. But in terms of the terminology, I mean, Islamism is a fairly new word that's being used, and it's doesn't say it's this distinction which I guess is safer because you don't critique the religion, you critique a branch of it that's not really part of it, and we're still having that same falling over themselves in terms of politicians talking about Islam in the UK and Europe, and I probably think it's the same in the US. It's a fear to call, as we say, call a spade, call it out for what it is.
Very much so, Peter. Look, you're very generous, really, to say that radical is going back to the root, and so that's okay to that's a perfectly accurate term to use because, of course, I don't know. Maybe Tulsi Gabbard has studied Latin and knows that radix means root, and that's the root word for radical in English. Maybe she knows that, but I suspect that she's using the word in the more common understanding of that these are the extremists, these are the people who are far out, who may be twisting and hijacking the real thing. The whole idea of calling them radical is to give the impression that there is a benign core that is not radical that we don't have to worry about. And those are the true Muslims. And then these people who are radical, they're the only ones that are the problem. And they're the fringe who are twisting the thing. The whole idea of Islamism is the same. Islamism was invented in the West. It does not exist as a concept within Islam, except as a Western import. The only reason why people speak about Islamism at all is so they don't have to speak about Islam. They know that it's, or well, they might not know. They want to avoid giving the impression, whether out of knowledge or intentional deception to protect themselves and their professional career or their political career. They want to distinguish what they are criticizing from Islam itself. The only problem with that is that it is Islam itself that is the source of these problems that they're criticizing. They're pretending that it's not, but it is.
As we've seen across maybe to politicians playing it safe. But about then we haven't spoken since President Trump actually took office, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on where the administration is going. Not that I want to get you into trouble or anything, but I mean, he has so much on his plate, so many issues that he has to deal with, and of course, immigration, which people see as separate from Islam, although it's all very part of it. But immigration and the economy are really the big ones, and maybe stopping wars abroad. And my concern is that Islam isn't seen as an issue or a threat by the administration. I don't know how you've seen over the last 6 months the administration and their approach to Islam.
Well, like I say, Tulsi Gabbard did say that. I haven't seen a whole lot of action in that regard. Trump has been disappointing. I don't know how it could get me in trouble. I don't have any connections to the administration. We're not arresting people for dissidents yet in the United States. Maybe, I mean, I know that's going on in Britain, and I hope you stay out of trouble. But in any case, so far, I mean, the Biden regime would have loved to do that, but they didn't quite get that far. Uh, Trump, he's not going to see this, but if he were to see it, he might think, well, I don't like this guy, but it's no skin off my nose. Anyway, he said back in 20 goodness, was it 2015 or 16? August, it was right around this time. I believe it was 2016, and we just had the ninth anniversary of him saying, in much the same way that Tulsi just did, that he was going to make sure he was campaigning for his first term, and said, we're not going to allow radical Islam to gain a foothold in the United States. Well, since then, he's changed. He hasn't said anything like that ever since. And in the 2024 election, he boasted proudly about support he got from imams in Michigan because they were disgusted with the Democrat Party's embrace of all the gender madness and all the far left sexual fantasies and delusions that they are so interested in propagating and disseminating among the wider population. And so a lot of Muslims, this has been the crack in the left Islamic alliance, and a lot of Muslims voted for Trump as a result. And I think perhaps in pursuit of that, he has muted his criticism that he previously had of what was essentially the jihad. It doesn't seem as if anybody has any clue about this on either side. And you have, on the one side, the left and the Democrats helping the Islamic Republic of Iran and old Joe Biden after October 7th, sending millions of dollars to Hamas. That is, and he said, no, 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 it's humanitarian aid to Gaza. Well, that means to Hamas, because who else is going to, who in Gaza is going to get the humanitarian aid and keep it out of the hands of Hamas? Obviously, no one. So he's funding Hamas. He's funding the Islamic Republic of Iran. He sends them $20 billion in unfrozen funds they belonged to the Shah, and every president since Jimmy Carter has kept them in anticipation of giving it back to a more humane regime in Iran. And Biden, after October 7th, when it's clear that the Iranians are funding this jihad against Israel, he sends them $20 billion. So the United States funded the jihad against Israel. So Trump comes in and we think, oh, that's going to stop. Great, it did stop. But he's pals with Qatar. What's Qatar? The Muslim Brotherhood, the Hamas leaders hiding out, cheering October 7th from watching it on video from Qatar. So out of the frying pan into the fire. And I'm sorry to see it, but at a certain point, you have to take the advice of Padre Pio, pray, hope, and don't worry. Just keep going and telling the truth and hope that it will someday come out. But Peter, it does mystify me that you have, I mean, I wrote a book back in 2018, The History of Jihad, and it was kind of depressing to write, tell you the truth. I think it's a good book. I'm proud of it, and I think it's an important book because there isn't any other history of jihad out there. And it's 1400 years of the advance of Islam with very little pushback. And I don't get how, I mean, of course, most people don't know that history. That's why the book was necessary to write. But how is it that this foe of the West for well over a millennium can suddenly become something you're not allowed to criticize in the West? And you're not allowed to point out that it was the foe of the West for over a millennium and has not changed since then in its theology or goals. It mystifies me.
Um, I, I, I think the book I would like to write, maybe as a comedy fairy tale, would be Gays for Gaza. I think it would be quite a fun book, maybe a comic strip or something
Yeah,
of this
children's book. Hey kids, time to leap off the roof.
the stupidity. You mentioned Muslim Brotherhood, and I've seen what recently with Rubio talking about Muslim Brotherhood being a prescribed organization, and of course in the UK and parts of Europe, I mean in London, many Islamic organizations operate in London with impunity that are actually banned in many parts of the world, and the Muslim Brotherhood have got their tentacles in all different organizations. Um, what is it like there in the US? Well, did I hear Rubio correctly saying that they're going to move to ban that? How will that work? Is that um, will that be a positive thing? What were your thoughts whenever that came out?
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear it, but here again, let's see what happens. There's been talk about this for all these years. Where is the action? And as it happens, Muslim Brotherhood linked operatives are embedded throughout the US government, and they have prevented it from happening thus far. And I noticed that it's been now a little while, not too long, but it's been a little while since this was first brooded about in this administration, and nothing's happened. I'm not holding my breath here because there are indeed very powerful forces that don't want it to happen. And the Council on American Islamic Relations, for all the evil that they represent, have been a very skillful and effective organization in the US. Maybe it's just money driven that they buy these people off, but they have lots of allies in high places. And lots of politicians want to have a photo, leftist politicians, and even some idiot conservative politicians want to have photo ops with these people and think they'll get the Muslim vote or whatever, like that guy that was at my talk in California. And this is something that then CARE and its allies cash in on. They go back to these politicians and they say, "We need a favor. We need you to vote against any action against the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you do, we'll deliver the district to you next year, the Muslim vote. And that could make the difference between winning and losing." Okay. Yes, sir. This is how it works in America. I'm sure it works to a great degree the same way in many areas of Britain and all over Europe. And so this is the big problem that we face in dealing with this issue. That for 20 some years now, these people have been embedded in the U.S. government, infiltrating everywhere, gaining influence, gaining friends, gaining power. It's not gonna be that easy just to say, "Okay, this is banned now. You gotta pack up and go home." It's gonna be very difficult.
Can I another issue in the UK, and I'm curious how it's impacted the US, is with the war in Gaza, and that was used by a lot of politicians on the left in the last general election in the UK a year ago. I think we now have 21 or 22 Muslim MPs, up from 16 before. I think we have more Muslim MPs in the UK than any other country in Europe, although I'd have to triple check that. But I wonder how in the US, how is that war, how has that acted in terms of the left and being able to drive the vote? And obviously, I know you've got the concern in New York of what may happen there, but kind of wider than that, has what's been happening in Israel and Gaza, has that been a potential boost or political boost to politicians in the US?
A boost?
A
Not
boost
very
to those from the left. So it drove the agenda very much so when you had Labour politicians saying they were standing for Gaza as opposed to standing for their own constituents. And
Oh,
they
yeah.
seem to care more about that. And has that kind of trickled into the US political scene in terms of electioneering?
Very much so, yeah, all over the place, top to bottom. You take, for example, last year, the presidential election, and Kamala Harris suddenly becomes the candidate for the Democrats and has to choose a vice presidential candidate. And the big contender was supposedly Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who was then rejected, at least reportedly, because he was Jewish and because she did not want to antagonize the increasingly influential and vocal pro-Hamas wing of the Democrat Party. And so she chose this fool, Tim Waltz, and ended up going down in flames. But not to say she wouldn't have lost with Shapiro as well. Probably the Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez wing of the Democrat Party would have bolted and refused to support the ticket. So that's what she wanted to head off. But that's just one thing. There are many other politicians who've come out, seeing the way the wind is blowing, come out in favor of a ceasefire at very least, or have denounced Israel for some bogus thing or other because they want the votes. And the Muslim vote is increasingly important in the United States, as it is in Britain, as the mass migration continues. Um, and what people don't understand in Britain or the United States is because Islam is a political entity as well as a religious one, and supremacist and expansionist as well as political, the Muslims immediately, when they come to a new country, are going to seek political power and are always going to have political power because they seek it out of proportion to their numbers. And so you have 21 or whatever it was Muslim MPs, and probably the Muslim population doesn't really justify that, but you've got people who vote as a block for any Muslim candidate because they understand that it is imperative for them as a Muslim to increase the political power of the Muslims. And it's the same thing in the United States as well, that they seek political power, they get political power, and wield political power in a way that makes other groups bend to their will. And yet nobody seems to be aware of this, and anybody who hears me talking about this and is not aware of it already is gonna say, "Oh, this guy's a racist, bigoted Islamophobe." But it's really just the lessons of history here.
No, of course. I want to look at some other areas in Europe that we've seen and get your thoughts on where the US fits. And you've obviously seen a massive demographic change in over in the UK and Europe with mass immigration. I think the UK is around 6% Muslim population. The US is probably just over 1%, if figures are correct. I think you have 2,500, 2,600 mosques. We've around 2,000, and the UK are a fifth the size. So the US are behind in terms of that, thankfully. But even in a read here an article last year by Fitch Ratings, the ratings company that gives the AAA ratings if you've got a good economy, and it said the UK remains a Western hub for the Islamic finance industry. London Stock Exchange is the third largest listing for US dollar sukuks globally, with 35% global share. Why the UK has got 35% global share of the sukuk market. And it goes into other areas. And I'm wondering, the US is much further behind in terms of Islamic banking, really in terms of halal food, which are both kind of economic jihad, is behind in terms of demographics. And I'm wondering, does that mean that maybe the US don't see Islam as a concern? I mean, they see it as a European problem, but not a US problem. Is that part of the problem with this conversation?
Yeah, but yeah, it's also that they don't think of it as a problem at all. That you say they see it as a European problem and not a US problem. Really, that's a function of their misapprehension of the whole issue, such that they see that the US has a problem with immigration from the South, from the southern border of Spanish speaking people who are coming from Mexico and South America. And Europe has a problem of immigration of Muslims coming from North Africa and the Middle East. And so they see it as a problem of immigration, which it is. But as far as it being a problem of Islam itself, very few people have any idea of that in the US mainstream. They would think that here again, it's racist and bigoted and Islamophobic to think such a thing. So when you're talking about Sharia finance, it's the same problem. People think of it as a series of accommodations that they can make that are completely value neutral and unimportant and just a matter of cultural sensitivity that will open up to them this massive new market. And the connection between Sharia finance and terrorism or Muslim Brotherhood linked pro Sharia organizations, they don't know or care about any of that in Britain or the US.
I mean, how big is the halal market? I mean, when I'm in London, most high streets I go down in London, the majority of takeaway shops are halal only, because you don't get a choice because it's much easier for them to have one supplier and one preparation area. But and often the bigger restaurants are going halal. And it has a mark, any chicken, anything you buy, and often they don't have poor products. I mean, and we've come to just accept that as as the sign of multiculturalism. That's wonderful. It shows how tolerant we are. I don't know if the halal industry has kind of forced its way as much into the US.
Yeah, it's very bad. See, this is the situation of people demanding something and insisting on it, and the other people on the other side don't care. So they give them what they want, here again, without realizing the implications. And so you have the Muslims saying, we have to have halal meat, and we won't eat anything else. And the non-Muslims say, we don't even know what halal is. We don't care. So all the meat becomes halal. And this is far more extensive than most people realize. As a matter of fact, about back when I was doing a lot of activism with Pamela Geller about 15 years ago, we discovered that a great deal of meat was being sold in the United States that was halal but was not labeled as such, because the people who were selling it figured nobody cares. The Muslims care, so we'll give them what they want, but nobody else cares. And so, like you said, it's easier not to have two different places for preparing everything. They just make everything halal. So we actually got an appointment and went to Washington and spoke with people in the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration, and they agreed that there were indeed people in the United States who did care and did not want to eat halal because they didn't want to have their money going to halal butchers and having that whole connection with Muslim Brotherhood linked organizations, which is pretty much every Muslim group in the US. And they might have disagreements based on the method of halal slaughter, which is very inhumane. So, animal rights activists who are not total vegetarians might object to halal, and so on. And all these officials we spoke to, they said, yes, yes, very important points. We will review all this and get back to you. And then they went totally dead. And we made repeated inquiries and they ignored us. And the issue, that was it. And so, as far as I know, there's no reason not to think that most of the meat or a good deal of the meat sold in the United States is still halal and it's not being labeled as such. And people have no idea.
Yeah, we still have that in the UK in terms of many supermarkets. It's still a huge issue, and no one seems to care. Um, can I touch on your book that you have coming up? And again, Holy Hell, Islam's Abuse of Women. That's one side, and the infidels who enable it, in terms of the West, the weak liberals accepting this as positive, and those are two very separate parts, I think, to that massive concern. And I know you'll talk about the grooming gangs that have happened, the Muslim rape gangs or Muslim Pakistani rape gangs or the Indian rape gang, however they're called, to try and get away from what the problem is. But I think Sweden is the only other country that actually the media has raised a concern of these rape gangs happening in Sweden has utterly collapsed. But I mean, two things. One, we're told this comes from just a tribe in Pakistan, so this is tribal, and this certainly isn't religious, and that's why the media are happy to call it Pakistani grooming gangs, and certainly not Muslim. But I want to get your thoughts on that. But also, I can't believe this is only happening in two countries of the world. So, what are your thoughts on the prevalence of this elsewhere?
Peter, it's happening all over. I have it in the book. I have information. Of course, there's a great deal of the book is about the UK, but also there is Sweden, Germany, France, Italy, and elsewhere. Australia. It's happening all over where there is Muslim migration. The reason why it's happening where there's Muslim migration is because it is something that is based on Islamic teaching. And nobody wants to talk about that, even still, even after all the controversy you've had in Britain over it over all these years, and Elon Musk reigniting the controversy last year, which was the impetus for my writing this book. And the Starmer government saying, no, we're not going to have a national inquiry. And there's still all this pressure. So finally, they have to relent and say they'll have a national inquiry. And I expect it'll just be another cover up. But in any case, nobody in all of this controversy has wanted to say the truth, except for Tommy and a few others. But you take, for example, and I discuss her in the book, the case of Sarah Champion, who was, as far as I know, she's still an MP. I don't know, but she was the shadow when the Conservatives were in power. She was a shadow labor minister for something or other. And she said back in 2017 that most of the rapists in these gangs were Pakistani. And there was a huge firestorm, and labor booted her out of the shadow cabinet, and she had to apologize. And yet most of the people in these gangs were Pakistani, and they weren't even doing but and see, the thing about this, Peter, is on the one hand she's great and courageous, and on the other hand she's a total coward, because she stood up to them enough to say this truth, that they're Pakistani. But then she backed down when she got pressure, and she didn't even come close to the real problem. The real problem was not that they're Pakistani. They could have been Somali, they could have been Arab, they could have been anything, because the problem is rooted in Islamic theology and the idea that if a woman goes out and she's not veiled, the Quran in chapter 33, verse 59 says that a woman should pull the veil over her bosom because then she will not be molested, which the hidden subtext there, the unspoken corollary, is that if you do not veil, you can be molested. And then you've got, of course, all the theology of the captives of the right hand in the Quran that makes it very clear that Muslim men can take non-Muslim women as sex slaves. So Muslim men come from Pakistan to Britain, and they see all these unveiled women. And of course, also, because they're unveiled, they've been taught back home and in their communities in Britain, these women are all whores, and they all want to have sex with you. All you have to do is grab them and go. And so they do. And they think this is something that Allah calls for in the Quran. And so it's a holy act. It's like a sacrament. It's not a vicious, dirty crime like we assume it to be in the West. And that's why you have the rape gangs consisting of a father and a son, and uncles and brothers, because they don't see anything wrong with this. In the United States, if some guy's a rapist, he's going to try to hide it from everybody around him, not just for fear of arrest, but for the shame of it. And he knows that his family would be ashamed if it turns out that he's a rapist. But in the Muslim culture, because of these teachings of the Quran, what's to be ashamed of? This is what these infidel women are for. This is what Allah, the perfect God, says in the Quran, the perfect book. And so, what do they have to be ashamed of? Everybody join in. And so, you even have wives helping the husbands do this because it's just the way men are. And it's Allah knows this. Allah made the men, Allah made the women, He made the infidel women. That's what they're for. But nobody will talk about it. Nobody talks about it in Britain. I can't go. Other people who talk about it can't go to Britain. Not a coincidence. Uh, the people who do talk about it, like Tommy, are viciously persecuted by the state. The only people who are in the mainstream who will talk about it don't come close to the truth about it, like Sarah Champion. And they still get trouble for even getting closer than most people are willing to. And so it's a very bad situation. You've got an entire society that seems resolute in its refusal to face the reality of this. Because, of course, if the British people as a whole knew that the governments, successive governments, both conservative and labor, they brought these people in and they let them do this because once they brought them in, they were afraid that they would lose elections if they admitted that they'd made a big mistake. And if they said, "We've got to stop this." And so they don't nobody stops it. Everybody says, "Oh, we're going to stop this." And they don't stop it. And they keep coming. And if they say, "We're going to stop this," then the obvious next question is, "Why have you allowed it to happen in the first place?" And then they lose entirely any credibility that they have as people who should be governing a state. So the whole establishment is now committed to this to save itself.
It,
And this is why Britain is done for. I'm sorry. I love you guys, but it's over. I don't see how you're gonna survive as a free society. Now, maybe there will be some new glorious revolution of 1688, happening yet again, and the, miscreants will be booted out of the government, but then you've got the mess they've created over the last 30 years. It's gonna be very hard to deal with. What are you gonna do? Deport people who are citizens, who've grown up there, and know that they're acting completely within their rights as Allah gave them the right to take these infidel women? This is it's a very, very difficult situation.
it is, and we one or two points in that I know you pick up on as we finish. You see, the closer you get to power, the less you want to engage with this, and we see that with Reform Party, with Nigel Farage, and he has now ruled back massively,
Mhm.
and basically sees Muslims as voters as opposed to having a clash between the freedoms we have in the West. So you see them rolling back, and then this it kind of becomes entertainment in some perverse way. Newspapers have it; they publish a story and they talk about it for a few days. The BBC does whole shows about this. You've got all party parliamentary groups on honor based abuse, and they invite these girls and they listen to them. People get books published. It kind of becomes like some perverse media industry,
Mhm.
and then they move on to the next, and
Salacious
it's diabolical.
it's, salacious stories about sex, sells papers. It's an old thing, going back. I don't know if the Sun still has the topless women on page 3, was it? And,
So
I remember reading about that and thinking, "Gee, that's terrible. That paper's out there, any kid can pick it up." And that was what, 30 some years ago they started doing that or longer. And, this kind of thing sells papers. And so you have this steady stream of stories that are along the same lines. Yeah, they're gonna get a lot of publicity, but nobody really dares to act because you've got this growing constituency that is, uh, increasingly wielding political power, and nobody wants to cross them.
absolutely. Can I just one last point? Want to just touch on Israel. People talk about Israel being the problem, and actually, if Israel wasn't there, then actually you might suddenly have a peaceful Islam because the issue is against Israel, um, as if Islam doesn't have a problem with the West, and that's a narrative that's certainly been repeated in the media, certainly since October the 7th attack, and long before then, that the blockage to peace is Israel. Maybe just remind the audience that if Israel didn't exist, then Islam wouldn't become peaceful overnight.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's the case, Peter. As you know, the imperatives to make war against and subjugate unbelievers do not apply only to Israel or to the Jews, but are general against all unbelievers. The Quran says, for example, in chapter 8, verse 39, fight until persecution is no more. And if it stopped there, you could justify saying, oh, jihad's only defensive, as the apologists like to say. But it doesn't stop there. It says, fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. So you could be minding your own business, or I could be minding my own business, never bothering them at all, never criticizing Islam. And if my religion is not all for Allah, then there are still going to be some Muslims someday who think we need to fight that guy. We need to fight all of them whose religion is not for Allah. So if people actually think that if Israel were to disappear, then there would be peace, they have no understanding of Islamic theology. And actually, if Israel were to disappear, which God forbid, then the jihadis would be more emboldened than ever and would be coming after the West with increased virulence. Not that they're not coming after the West already.
No, absolutely. Robert, always appreciate you coming on, and certainly for the viewers and listeners, you do such a wide range of books. Last year, Muhammad, a critical biography, the one on women, Holy Hell, coming up later this year, but also general ones. And I think it's fantastic the options and the availability and the knowledge you've given that people can actually go on a specific topic or get one of the books which are more general. So I've encouraged the viewers and listeners to go and make sure on jihadwatch.org or just put Robert's name in Google in Amazon and take a pick. Pick one that sounds interesting to you, because I know you will be blessed reading it and be better informed. So, Robert, thank you as always for giving us your time.
Always good to talk to you, Peter. Thank you.
If you like what we do, sign up to our mailing list. Donate, share, and subscribe to our many platforms at heartsofoak.org. Thank you for listening.